G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going through my team selection for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. So as always, if you're new around here, please do drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, always helps me immensely, and very much hoping to get towards a subscriber goal of 9,500 by the end of the season. But we'll jump straight into how the team did in Italy first and foremost before we unpack what this means for our teams in the upcoming race weekend. I had 226 points across the board. Not a bad weekend, but not a great weekend either. The McLaren decision on the deadline, if you tuned in for that, whether I go Piastri, Norris, McLaren Williams, or the Piastri, McLaren Ferrari with Albon combination, was one I was toing and froing, but ultimately landed on the lineup you see here on screen. Oscar came away with 50 points as the 2X. By no means his best performance this season. He's had a number of results well above that mark, but to still finish on the podium, you come away with 25 points, not a bad result. I think the fact that anyone that went with Norris as their 2X, who nabbed the fastest lap on the last lap of the race, certainly capitalized on that and probably resulted in a much higher rank boost than my measly 400 places. Aside from that, Alex Albon was the other transfer in. It was Albon and Ferrari in for Aston Martin and Lando Norris. Happy very much with the Alex Albon swap. He's been looking incredibly consistent this season. You take out his streak of 3 DNFs in a row between Spain and Austria, Albon has been in a class above every other driver in the midfield. Another double-digit score to his cap, another feather in his cap. And I'm really liking what I'm seeing from the Thai driver this season. I wrote about him in my article for Formula1.com last week. I very much think he should be on anyone's watch list that doesn't already own him in Baku as well for that budget gain and that points potential. Further down the list, the Aston Martin duo of Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll certainly wasn't a groundbreaking result. And look, heading into the deadline, I was always going to keep Fernando Alonso. Obviously not ideal to not avoid the DNF, but it was a matter of time until he did. He's looked exceptionally consistent lately, and you know, with every driver that goes through a spell of good form, there's bound to be a bad result mixed in there somewhere. Alonso's last DNF was all the way back in Monaco. So to go, 8 races in a row with double-digit points in almost every single one of them, very, very happy with the outcome there. Similarly, Hülkenberg suffered a same fate. He hasn't retired at all this season. It was his first retirement in Italy. He was disqualified in Bahrain, but aside from that blemish, he's had an impeccable season as an F1 fantasy asset. But yes, those two drivers, very template-heavy assets for the last kind of 5 to 10 races or so, or at least since Spain, Canada. Definitely thinking they will be falling out of favor with F1 fantasy managers in Baku. The Aston Martins, especially a friend of the slower speed corners in Zandvoort, not the same at Monza, and probably won't also translate too well in Baku. So Alonso and Stroll, we'll talk about them a little further in the video, but looking like obvious sells for me in the next race weekend. Bortoleto, just chugging along. Really impressed by what I've seen from him lately. That's been his third double-digit score in the last 6 races after his 25 in Austria and then his 24 in Hungary. And just doing everything you'd expect from a driver and more at his price. So very happy with Bortoleto. I think he'll be firmly entrenched in the midfield in Baku. A couple of overtakes, positions gained. I think about 5-6 is probably what we could come to expect from him. But Baku's not an easy track. So if you're not too optimistic about his chances, then there's certainly other options to explore. McLaren 97, enough said. And then Ferrari, the 67, I think my decision was vindicated with going down that route. I know there was some deliberation over going Williams and Rain. If you follow him on YouTube, he went down the Piastri, Norris, McLaren, Williams route. The scores between these teams came out almost identical. I think he had around 230, I had 226. So 4 points is negligible. Just goes to show how tight these race weekends can be in F1 fantasy. But I don't really fault anyone going the triple McLaren, because the way McLaren look right now, it almost feels like a no-brainer on certain weekends. So notwithstanding that, very happy with the team. A small rank jump, but not by much. But we have eclipsed the $130 million budget threshold. So I think that gives me a bit more flexibility heading into Baku, which we will unpack in just a second. Some of the key weekend notes, I know we were just talking about Ferrari. The decision to go down their route was in the deadline stream, not just because of that consistency and flexibility, I suppose, it offered to midfield drivers like Albon and such, but also because of the qualifying teamwork points. Yes, Hamilton has looked a little off the pace lately, but more often than not, both drivers do make it into Q3. You throw in the pit stops, which again haven't maybe been their best source of points in the last few weeks, but have over the course of the season looked quite good in that department. A reason for me choosing to go down that path. Williams, on the other hand, they looked good, but I think after FP3, their true pace was probably a little bit more representative than what we saw in FP1 and FP2. And you also throw in the fact that when you run that Williams lineup, you're obviously leaving a premium driver that you can't 2X. In the case of the Williams, McLaren, Norris, Piastri, it probably would have been Piastri for me and many people. But, you know, in some cases like Leclerc, if you can't get to Norris, that's where I think the decision as to whether or not the Ferrari constructor, which you can't 2X to begin with, makes more sense for my team personally. So I think there's definitely a lot of variety we're starting to see in F1 Fantasy, but for those people that are able to reach to that 4A or 4A heavy, as Ewan's called it, I think we're going to see a little bit more convergence again over the coming weeks. A quick note on Kimi Antonelli. The 4A was, I think for him, or the 4A light, again stealing Ewan's terminology, something that people were considering in the European leg, but now that we're kind of at the end of it now, he's only had a couple of sound results over the last 8 races or so, that 35 in podium in Canada and then 21 in Belgium, but it was a sprint weekend where you do score more points, so you'd almost argue that was inflated just a little bit. His last 3 races of 6, 1 and 10, just not good enough for a driver at his price in a top 4 team. So I think any chance of him entering the framework or the landscape of an F1 Fantasy lineup probably is discounted, especially when you take the likes of Albon, Hadjar, Bortoleto, etc. in the midfield, scoring very well for drivers at a much more affordable price point. So I think right now Antonelli is a miss. We'd really want to see more from him to reconsider him in our F1 Fantasy lineups. Now, speaking of those midfield drivers that are scoring so well, they're offering a lot of routes to budget growth, as you know, some of you that might still be on the budget building train, some of you that might be well past the 4A threshold, you can get to 4A heavy with premium midfield drivers. You have to decide ultimately, depending on where your budget is, when you want to stop building budget. I think the unofficial cutoff for building budget is when we get to 3X chip season in the sprint race weekends, which is not until we get to Coda, 3 races away or so. But as it stands right now, I don't have an issue with people wanting to continue to do that, especially if you're a little bit behind budget and you want to get to that 2 premium driver, 2 premium constructor lineup for the 3X chip later in the year. The thing is, when we have a budget to get to those premium lineups, and I myself, we can talk about that in just a second, is on the table, a decision needs to be made as to whether or not you want to go for the 4A, Piastri, Leclerc, Ferrari, McLaren, with the rubbish 4.5 millions at the bottom, so the Alpine drivers and a Sainz or a Lawson or something, or you continue to build budget for a couple more race weekends to have more flexibility in the midfield, which is what my 4th point on the screen here alludes to. I had a situation last year where my budget was probably $1 million or $2 million behind most engaged managers just because of my horrific luck with DNS, and if you followed me along last year, you'd know I probably wasn't beaten by anyone in F1 Fantasy with 26 DNFs or whatever it was over the season. Slightly different story this time around, so budget's slightly better. But as soon as you get backed into a corner with 2 premium drivers and the cheapest midfield drivers, so 4.5 millions, unless those 4.5 million drivers are going up, which doesn't really seem to be the case all that much at the moment with the Alpine duo, you kind of get stuck with that same team week in, week out. And unless you're prepared to downgrade, say, a Leclerc or a Russell to an Antonelli or whatever it might be, you are, in that case, then stuck with that team for a number of different races, unless you have a wild card or whatever it is to pivot into something else. So that's why I'm reluctant in Baku to jump on that right now, even though I can afford it. Lots to discuss and decide, but it doesn't feel like it's an immediate yes for me, just with the fact that we've got so many reliable midfield drivers likely to spike in price again in Azerbaijan. A couple of thoughts on some drivers that are on the radar for a couple of different people this weekend, and I think it is very much team dependent, so I do excuse the cliche I've used there. Let's talk about Ollie Behrman first before we get into Pierre Gasly. Ollie Behrman's looked pretty decent. I say decent. He's had a good result recently, but over the course of the year has been pretty good for fantasy production. Haas in general in the midfield just seem to be a car that aren't necessarily the fastest on Saturday, but do have decent race pace and become a magnet for overtakes and positions gained, which is exactly, as you can see with Behrman on screen here, what you're getting from him at 6.7 million. Now, he is one of the highest owned assets in the game, but I will say, I don't know if that 27 for me is enough to convince me he's worth owning beyond Baku. And I say that because as soon as that 27 drops off his average, the price threshold, or the threshold for a max price rise for Behrman is going to increase by the time we get to Singapore. Singapore is also a very low overtake track, traditionally speaking. So there's a possible risk, thinking a couple races down, whether or not if Behrman doesn't qualify all that well, if he becomes a sell, I should say, or an avoid. So I'm going to just quickly, you can see here on the screen here, Behrman's kind of, very much in the midpoint for average points per race. But if we go to qualifying position, Behrman is much further down the order here. He's one of the worst qualifiers on the grid. He hasn't had a Q3 result since when was that? A P8 in Silverstone at home. So that's his solitary Q3 appearance since going all the way back to Japan. I'm not wholly convinced he's a good asset beyond this weekend. I think for sure if Haas get it right, if Ollie Behrman looks good in free practice, then I think he's potentially viable. But I think at this point of the season, especially for those of you that don't have a wild card, you really need to think about rolling transfers to have 3 available for when you do pivot into that 4A lineup. I have my wild card, so I can absolutely be more flexible with who I bring into my team because I can just rip them out on a whim the following race weekend if I'm not happy with how the team looks. But I think something just to consider there is, yes, Behrman on face value seems like a great asset in the budget builder. He also doesn't need much for a max rise either. He's the second lowest. I'll just quickly bring that up on screen here. The budget builder, he has the second lowest threshold for a price rise in Baku. But if you're someone that is looking at the 4A in Baku, in Singapore, wherever it might be, and you haven't got a lot of transfers handy or a wild card, I probably wouldn't be looking at Oliver Behrman personally. There are people that do have that flexibility. I think he's perfectly fine if you do have that. But I'm not seeing A, the level of consistency from him, in my opinion, to make him a longer term hold, and B, with transfers and such, there are probably more pressing things to address in our team. Now, speaking of drivers that are a bit more flexible to enable that 4A lineup, Pierre Gasly speaks to me on that level. Now, him and Franco Colapinto, his teammate, are both priced at $4.5 million. I'm certainly not suggesting that you should go out and buy both of them, but again, someone to keep in mind that at a cheaper price probably will enable you to reach to those more expensive Leclerc's, Piastris, Ferraris, McLarens. Yes, his points are pretty dreadful. 0, 0, and 5 over the last 3, and on balance is one of the worst point scoring assets in the game this season. I'm not exactly ecstatic to own an Alpine driver, but if you're tossing up between him and Colapinto, for me, it is a no-brainer. Gasly's had, yes, 1 DNF over the last 8 or so races, so has Colapinto, and I fully expect that at some point, one of the two drivers will probably feature in a lot of F1 fantasy teams, but I'm just taking Gasly over his experience. He had a good result in Baku a couple years ago as well. And as a slightly lower owned asset between, say, him and Behrman, I think gives off that little bit of a differential. I'm not saying he's a must buy, certainly not in Baku as well, because if we look at the budget builder, you'll see he's very well down the order compared to, say, Colapinto, Albon, Behrman, Hadjar. But get that 0 to drop off after his score in the Netherlands, 5 is nothing. But 5, and let's say he gets another 5 in Baku, that'll be enough, hopefully, for a minimum price rise the race after. So I think just simply because of his price and that he enables upgrades elsewhere, I like Gasly for that. But I'm not suddenly rushing to buy him, particularly if you've got the likes of Hadjar, Albon, etc. that you need to target. So just my 2 cents on a couple of drivers, but I think the general consensus is Albon, Hadjar, maybe even Bortoletto if you don't own them are probably higher buys. Just wanted to talk about 2 that speak to me right now as ones worth thinking about. So Early team thoughts for Baku. Now, I'm not saying that every driver on my team is a hold. Still fighting off my cough if you guys were tuning into my deadline stream. But I do think the Aston Martin duo almost are a no-brainer for my team this week. So let's take a look at how the team is shaking up. There are a couple of different options available to me, and personally, I think this may well change in the lead up to the Baku deadline, but my read of the situation for my team is at least two different approaches I could take. The first being, because I've got the wildcard handy, is to strip out both of these guys and put in Oliver Bearman and Isaac Hadjar. If I didn't have the wildcard, I would not be looking at Bearman personally. I'd be looking to roll one and hold one. Yes, admittedly, both Aston Martin drivers are quite well down the order. But for me, Stroll, just because I think there's slightly more upside to at least squeeze a 0.2 million rise. If not, a 0.2 million is not the end of the world. But I feel like this could be an easy pivot into for a lot of people. If I was looking to set up my team, so I could potentially roll one if I didn't have the wild card, but I want to be as aggressive with my transfers as much as possible. It could be that, and that, or potentially Gasly, as I talked about. There's really no one else that speaks to me at that same level for price upside. Potentially Colapinto, but again, I'm very worried about him at a track like Baku, and there's already rumors swirling that he may not see the end of the season. So could also be a transfer out at some point down the line. If I don't go down that route, the wildcard is very much in play for me. Now, that would mean the 4A lineup. I talked about that just before. I can get to that lineup, but it would require the two, as Ewan calls it, bottom of the barrel assets. So Gasly and Colapinto with Bortoleto. You might not be able to afford this. You might have to downgrade a Bortoleto. I'd probably take Carlos Sainz over Liam Lawson. I say that because Williams did look good at Monza. Sainz just seems to get in the worst situations possible. If that's too much risk, then maybe Sainz is not your guy, but there really isn't much to choose from. Lawson 9, Sainz 10 in terms of the budget builder. I can't obviously get to Albon. If you're fortunate enough, you might be able to get to Hadjar, which I'd obviously recommend out of the three. But also my thing is glitching. I can't seem to get Bortoleto in. But you see kind of this is the theme of where I potentially could go. Do I like this team for budget building? Kind of, but not really. Again, to the point earlier, I'm backed into a corner with these Alpine drivers that may not go up in price. And so it then becomes a matter of rotating this middle driver. I'd rather kind of boost my budget just a little bit more and have the flexibility to reach an Isaac Hadjar or an Oliver Bearman instead of having to double up on Alpine, which are comfortably sat at the back of the grid. So a couple of different options. I think the most likely route for my team right now is just going to stick with the kind of heavy premium midfield for one more race, and then bring in Albon, and then that that fifth driver slot is up for debate. Simply Bearman, because of the budget upside, as I've talked about, it doesn't need much. That's kind of the reason why, if I just get him in for one race, then wildcard him out in Singapore, that would hopefully pull me a little bit further up to get those more attainable premium drivers in the midfield, as opposed to being stuck with the bottom of the barrel. So that's my initial thoughts on my team so far. There will be more of this in my final thoughts video, so hang around for that closer to the deadline next week and a likely deadline stream as well. So I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. As always, hope you're enjoying the week off in between the races, and I'll be back, as I said, next week with more content. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all very soon.